Welcome to episode 4 of the RJM Classic Motorcycles podcast. We're a father and son motorcycle restoration business established in 1989. Coming up later in the episode, we're sharing a fantastic tip for getting rid of rust, but our main segment this week is a buyer's guide. As I'm sure you can imagine, we get to work on many recently purchased bikes that haven't lived up to expectations, so hopefully this will help avoid disappointment. As always, you can visit our website at rjmclassic.com or email me specifically about the podcast at rjmpodcast@gmail.com. On with the show. If you look on our website, you will see that we have a buyer's guide. Where did the idea for that come about, Ray?
Well, people seem to need help, and when we were compiling the current version of the website, it seemed obvious to put some basic golden rules there. We could probably do with expanding it now, but hopefully we might do that now.
Yeah, I think initially, regarding purchasing a classic motorcycle, it really is a minefield, and looks can be deceiving.
Looks are always deceiving. The problem essentially stems from the fact that there's a lot of people out there restoring bikes speculatively for resale, and obviously if they're doing that, the sort of money they can spend on it is severely limited. As a consequence, you get a lot of corners cut, and whilst the bikes themselves may look cosmetically passable, you don't need to look over them too thoroughly with a tutored eye to realise that, you know, there's lots of trouble there.
Yeah, and I still naively, when something comes in that looks, very shiny, I think, oh, well, we won't have too much of a problem here giving this a routine service, but time and time again stuff comes to light. And it's a shame that we have to spoil people's fun, because in all innocence, they've purchased a machine for what they'd consider to be the going rate, and it looks to be a tidy example, but that's really not always the case.
No, and also there tends to be a bit of self-deception that goes on in terms of the fact, and you know this as well as I do, a lot of people will bring a machine and say, oh, it's only done 20,000 miles from new. Well, except in very rare circumstances and on very rare occasions, I'm going to blanketly disagree, because, I was there when these things were being used as workaday transport, and the state a lot of them got into. Add in the fact that actually Smith's instruments weren't that reliable. As a consequence, you actually seldom see an odometer on a classic bike with more than 20,000 miles on it in the first place. And the naive belief that this engine has probably never been apart.
Yeah, which we get all too often.
Yeah. Most of the people who are buying these things have no idea how they were treated back in the day, because again you come back to the pivotal point that you're buying by and large a machine without any service history. Why would there be any? Well, because it's never seen the inside of a workshop, not a professional workshop, not in 30, 40, 50 years.
No, and I think the phrase "it's only done X miles from new" is very much one of those things that people say as if it's a good thing, but if you're talking 20, 30,000 miles, I think people are judging that by the standards of a modern car, for example, when actually if the engine's never been apart 20, 30,000 miles, you're getting on for a rebuild, I think.
Well, certainly at one time, and this is in, I think, the comparatively early days of the Triumph Twins, Turner's goal was always to produce a machine that would do 25,000 miles with only routine servicing.
Yeah.
So that was a goal. And the other thing which people tend to forget is back in the late 60s and early 70s, your average Ford Cortina engine was good for about 40,000 miles before you'd be expecting to put a reconditioned short motor in the thing. So the expectation, as you say, with a modern car or anything produced in the last 20 years, with regular servicing, and sometimes even without regular servicing, they'll do 250,000 miles standing on heads. The bodies will fall off long before the mechanics give up. So for somebody to, as you say, buy something and proudly declare that it's only done 25,000 miles, if it has only done 25,000 miles, then it probably is coming up for its first engine rebuild.
Yeah, and while we're talking about things that people say as if it's a good thing, another one of my favourites is, it was put aside X years ago and hasn't been touched since.
Well, yeah, that's and it was put aside because back then nobody parked up a serviceable vehicle. Nobody could afford to. So it was parked up 20, 30 years ago because there was something wrong with it. And there's probably still something wrong with it because these problems don't just heal up.
No. It's, was it Saudi Arabia where a lot of particularly A65s were sold for use by the military, for example?
Yeah, the Saudi police and army used Thunderbolts by the thousand. And back then, they hadn't really got anybody to maintain and repair and service them. So as a consequence, these things just got parked up in the desert when they failed to run for the most simple of reasons. And they just draw a new one from the depot.
Yeah. Another one of my favourites is, it was built by this bloke who races them.
Oh, yeah, well, we've had more disastrous engine rebuilds presented to us for remedial work that have been done by ex-racers or current racers than just about anything else.
Well, and I'm sure as an ex-racer yourself, you saw all kinds of bodges and things going on.
Well, perhaps not so much certainly in the racing context, but of course what you did see, and this is, back again in the late 60s and early 70s, nobody had the money to have these things repaired properly. Very few people could afford new or nearly new bikes. So we were operating on a shoestring from the get-go, and against a background of actually parts availability back then being worse by a country mile than it is now.
Yeah, ironically.
And again, that was only because the industry at the time, having discovered Japanese motorcycles that could be prepared for delivery as a new bike by giving them a wipe over with a damp rag, they weren't interested in the Brit stuff. They got rid of those franchises quick as anything. And being pathologically mean almost to a man, all those old Brit parts went down in the basement, never to be seen again. So, and because we couldn't afford new bits, because new bits weren't available, and because, as I've famously said time and time again, if you broke it on Saturday night, you got Sunday to fix it, to go to work Monday. Now, some of those repairs were not very pretty, but that was acceptable then because that's what you had to do. And to be honest, also, back then they weren't classic bikes.
Yeah.
That little phrase didn't get coined until early to mid 70s.
Yeah.
So there was no historic value to them. It was just a machine to get you to work. And if X, Y, or Z bodge was going to do that for another few weeks, that's what it got.
Yeah, I mean, just to round off on it was built by this bloke that races them. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly wrong to wheel that out as, well, I know it's going to be good because of that.
Well, it depends who the racer is, of course. If you've just acquired a Triton that was built by Dave Deegans, then you've got something, but you've also paid a premium for it.
Yeah. Also, when people say, oh, well, it's just been fully restored or the motor's just been rebuilt, and you say, by who?
Well, actually, the phrase is usually it's just been done up.
Yes, yeah.
But, as you say, without wishing to belittle anybody's purchases or anybody's efforts, the question is it somebody we know? And if it is, do we know good things about them or bad things about them? But usually it's somebody completely unknown. And there again, in the 26 years that I've been in business full time, there's been all sorts of little outfits that have come and gone and, been around for a few years, not managed to make a success of it. I presume because of too many warranty claims, and have, gone away and tried something easier.
If you look at our website on the buyer's guide at rjmclassic.com, you will find some of Ray's golden rules for purchasing a bike. This was written back in 2008, so I'm going to quiz you on this and see what you remember and see what you have to expand on.
Yeah.
The first one is, don't buy anything in a fit of rose-tinted retrovision. Research. Know what you're looking for, know what it should cost, know what the weak points are, and know what the spares situation is like.
Well, there's lots could be added to that, and I suppose the reason for that specific set of comments is that people will say, for example, I want a Bonnie. Now, there's lots of different Bonnies, and different Bonnies will be priced differently, according to their desirability. So, for example, if you just pick up a Bonnie, it may be that you're interested in one from mid-60s to the start of the 70s, in which case, in terms of the classically revered Bonneville, that's probably the one. The only problem is, of course, you're going to pay a premium for it, a big, big premium. And, you may be spending way more money than you need to if, for example, a T140 is more to your taste. And there's good reasons for preferring that over and above other models, purely on the grounds of spares availability. Then you could get a machine that suits you better for an awful lot less money. Similarly, if you go the pre-unit route, again, you're going to be paying a massive premium. And because the bike is that much older, and because it was originally in service at a time when people had very little money, again, some of these things have been through hell on earth before they were then, resurrected and shoved in somebody's showroom or in an ad on eBay somewhere. So you just don't know. But again, to expand even further on that theme, if you get to the first year oil in frame models, they represent some of the cheapest Bonnies, and by Bonnies I mean trophies and TR6s as well. But again, they have their issues, they have their styling challenges as well, and the fact that because the first couple of years oil in frame had such a poor reputation, people have merrily altered them, modified them, hacked and carved them, and turned them very often into something that looks like nothing like what nature intended. But by the same token, we're now getting in a situation where an original first or second year oil in frame machine is becoming stylistically a bit iconic, and is starting to appreciate in value. My personal feeling, if I was ever going for one of these machines, it would have to be the V version, V meaning 5-speed gearbox, because actually that transforms the whole bike. The 5-speed gearbox on an oil in frame Bonnie makes it feel like a much more modern motorcycle. That's why I say research. Know what it is you're buying, and be aware of the issues. I mean, for example, if you've got a mid to late 60s or even an early 70s Bonneville with the famous 9-stud head, if you've got serious problems with your 9-stud head, you're not going to find one. You're going to have to work with what you've got or find a slightly better one if you're lucky that can be repaired. Unlike, for example, and I always used to say with A65s, and we'll come on to those in a minute, that you could go to just about any auto jumble and lift up a few boxes and go through a few piles of debris, and you'd find another A65 head there that was probably in serviceable condition. And of course, I've recently managed to completely prove that even in this day and age by one of my projects, having found a brand spanking new 1968 Lightning head sitting quietly in Illinois, which is now sitting quietly in Halsey.
The second golden rule is one that I think is often overlooked: is join the owners club before buying the bike.
Absolutely. I mean, I have so many people, and not just with the mainstream. I suppose, in a sense, more particularly for owners of less mainstream classic vehicles, they'll very often come on the phone initially to us with all sorts of problems and difficulties, which, I mean, if it happens to be a James Captain, I probably can't tell you what wheel pin, what went where, which year, and frankly, I couldn't be less interested in it. So that the fact that they've acquired a bike without, actually plugging into, the infrastructure and the facilities which are there, because again, very often when it comes to buying, if you join the owners club, they have small ads in their club magazine, and I would say, if you're buying member to member as part of an owners club, you're much less likely to get a bad one than you will buying off eBay.
I think so. The third golden rule is don't assume that buying from a dealer gives you any safeguards or guarantees that it has been professionally restored.
Well, I make one or two cryptic references to this on this part of the website, but I think there is an assumption that if you buy from, a shiny showroom somewhere, or even less than shiny showroom, that all of these bikes are going to be fully and professionally restored, and nothing in my experience could be further from the truth. What we have seen over the years is a number of, probably what were high street names who are no longer with us commercially, sort of gathered around them, this little retinue of hobbyists who were serial restorers and who would restore speculatively for resale, not resale to the public, but resale to this company who's then going to launder them on. Now, because every corner has been cut very often to produce a vehicle which actually can't possibly be fit for purpose, that's when the struggle comes. When you're looking at buying something that's £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 these days, that has undergone full restoration, well, you don't need to be too familiar with these things to know you can't possibly restore a bike of that sort of ilk for that sort of money and for it to be any good.
The penultimate golden rule is, unless you are an expert, don't buy a non-runner, and remember, basket cases are only good as spares donors.
Well, yeah, I mean...
I maybe wouldn't say spares donors, but I mean in the hands of someone who's not sure what they're doing. I mean, I think this as a point is really just as a warning, because it's very easy to look at a quote-unquote project and think, oh, well, I don't think that would be too taxing to get up and running, and it's all too easy for that to... I mean, many of the vehicles we have in the shop at the moment are things that people had intended to do themselves, but things got in the way.
The problem is with basket cases is that very often there's more of a history there than you think there is. Very often, for example, somebody who's restoring a machine and finds himself short of a number of difficult to find bits and pieces have been known in the past to buy a complete other bike and harvest the vital parts from that and then move that on as a basket case project. Of course, what the unsuspecting purchaser of that doesn't realise is all the really difficult to find and expensive bits have gone. They're not there anymore.
And the last golden rule, which I'm not sure if that's fully up to date at the moment. You tell me what you think. Finally, before you ask, I wouldn't bid on a bike in an online auction in a fit. To be fair, I did recently learn of a guy who actually came out on top of one of those deals. He was the first I'd heard of, only because the vendor had even less of a clue than the buyer. What was that story, first off, if you remember?
Well, that was a local rider who bought a 64 Bonneville off of eBay. And I think the vendor didn't necessarily know what he got. I think he'd probably had a few difficulties with it and was keen to move it on. But actually, we got to see it soon after it was purchased, and actually somebody had spent a small fortune on that bike, and it was absolutely kosher 64 bonnet, because of course there were a lot of changes in the following year that very often you find Bonnevilles available for sale of around that sort of period tend to be a conglomeration of actually the specification from about 3 different years. You've got to hope that all the bits that are working together are the best options. But this had absolutely been built up as an absolutely kosher 64. And actually, when you looked at it, he got it for a bargain price. Right. So I have in recent times had to modify my thinking on that one, and eventually will, update the website.
Sure.
But there are some reasonable deals to be had out there via that route. Mind you, as we've seen, there's some real stinkers as well.
Absolutely.
You and I are able to, look at a description and look at a set of photographs on an eBay page or whatever, and say, well, that's wrong and this is wrong, and goodness, where did that come from, and so on and so forth. Which is why, as you know, we've offered very often this facility. Anybody who comes to us first before making the purchase can again plumb into our expertise to some extent, and I've said quite openly and honestly that I'm perfectly happy if somebody's looking to purchase a classic bike. If they see something on eBay they like, send me the link. I'll have a quick look at it and try and find a reason why you can or can't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, there's really only so much you can tell from a picture, but you can certainly wheedle out some definite things to avoid.
I think you can very easily see the mood music, because if if X, Y, and Z are present or not present, then there's a good chance that something else has been bodged as well.
That's true. So we've gone through the golden rules. If I can, in a slightly quick-fire format, throw some examples at you of things people might say, this is what I'm looking at getting, what would you say? So if I phone you up and say, I want a triple, I want a Rocket 3 or a T150 or something, what do I need to be looking at?
Well, I'd say in the first case, be very careful. I would also, as I always do when somebody phones me up to talk about Rocket 3s or Tridents, is they come with a wealth warning. Now, you look initially at one of those machines. I can, to some extent, see the appeal, because they were, in many regards, the final last gasp development of a British motorcycle. But first things first, of course, I will always say to them, if you're going to look at a vehicle, take something to lay on, take a very powerful torch, and possibly take a mirror as well, because what you need to do is try and get a look at the condition of the gearbox sprocket. Now, I say this, and particularly to those who are in the beginning modern riders and who are thinking of branching out into classic British ownership, they will be used, for example, with the Japanese machine, of, for want of a better description, doing a chain and sprocket kit in an afternoon.
Yeah.
Well, if you're making that same assumption with the Rocket 3 or Trident, you're in for a big surprise, and you're in for an even nastier surprise if it turns out to be a T160 and it has got a worn-out gearbox sprocket, because you've got to take half the bloody vehicle apart to achieve that. Because unlike a modern Japanese bike, or even a less modern Japanese bike, you take one cover off to reveal the gearbox sprocket. You won't do that on anything British. And on the Tridents, the Rocket 3s, the entire primary driver's got to come apart. The clutch has got to come off, the bell housing's got to come off to get to the gearbox sprocket. To get that off, you've got to, on a 160, take the starter motor off. To take the starter motor off, you've got to take all the carburetors and the airbox off. So, what started off life potentially as an afternoon's work or a 300 quid job in a workshop's now $2,000.
And I think no matter what machine you're looking at, there's going to be some little niggle like that you need to be aware of, which goes back to, as we say, talk to the owners.
Absolutely right. There's very, very few machines which don't have some nuances, either mechanically or more ephemeral than that. I always quote the self-fulfilling prophecy of the A65 buying history, because if we go back to when Classic Bike Guide started, and shortly after, Classic Bike Magazine also did a buyer's guide in terms of values.
Yeah.
And these guides were largely compiled from the prejudices of the people who were compiling them, nobody of whom seemed to like A65. So, for example, you got, at that time, they were quoting mid to late 60s Bonnevilles as being, worth £4,000, £5,000, £6,000, and the equivalent Lightning as 1,500.
Yeah.
Well, that really wasn't the truth. But of course, as a consequence, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that because A65s were not considered sought after and valuable, people didn't spend any money on them. And as a consequence, if you find one today, you can still, to some extent, expect to play catch-up on the repairs and maintenance bills.
Yeah. I was aiming for quickfire there, but that didn't happen. I think we're both to blame. Let's try and rattle through the others fairly swiftly.
Okay.
I'm phoning you up. I want a Bantam.
Don't do it.
Next one. I want a Goldie or anything valuable of that nature.
Well, yeah, the problem with Goldies, Rocket Goldies, pre-unit Bonnies and all those kind of things, you will frequently find, because of the inherent value of these things, that they have been resurrected from the dead. Whereas, say, for example, if you had a really, really knackered gold flash, back in the 70s, you'd throw it away. It was probably only worth 30 or 40 quid. But, of course, if it was a Rocket Goldie, even if it was completely trashed, you'd managed somehow to get it back on the road and shiny to sell it to some poor schmuck. So be careful of that. They're not all like that, but a lot of them are. You can get caught so easily also by replicas because, there are now, I think it's fair to say, more Goldies and Rocket Goldies and Lightning Clubmans on the planet than BSA ever produced.
Yep.
I'll leave you to work out why that might be yourself.
Next two we've kind of touched on, but I'm phoning you up and I say I want an A65.
Right, well, again, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. If you look at the very early ones, they look more like, a road rocket that's been out in the rain. So, in other words, the styling, considering they completely reworked all the mechanicals, or to some extent, to end up with this lovely compact, some people say ugly, but I like it. Beauty is as beauty does, and I think it was a masterpiece of re-engineering. And they did all that and clothed it in an almost identical set of clothing to the previous model. So it wasn't actually until about the mid to late 60s that A65 really had a style all of its own, which was then completely destroyed when they went oil in frame. I love them to bits. Again, they are nuanced. There's bits and pieces that you need to know. The famous timing side bush is not the Achilles heel everybody makes it out to be, but it's something you need to be aware of and to address. And as I say, you may have to play catch up on repairs, maintenance and improvements, but actually I think they're a better bike.
As I say, we touched on this, but I'm phoning you up and I want a Bonneville. What do I do?
Well, first of all, I need to find out what age you are. Because you're going to want the Bonnie that was around when you were a teenager. So, for example, if somebody was a teenager in the 70s and early 80s, they're probably not going to be looking at a pre-unit. They're probably not going to be looking at a pre-oil in frame. They're going to be looking at an oil in frame. And, of course, for them, they're going to get the best deal because they're going to get a motorcycle that isn't as ancient as some of the others. You're going to get one that certainly hasn't done as much work as the others, is likely to be cheaper than the others, and where, there is even now plentiful spares.
And the last one, pre-war, anything pre-war. I want something pre-war.
Well, good luck. No, to be fair, this is a category of vehicle which is the domain of the hobbyist, and I really don't think that anybody who's buying that kind of vehicle can rely on spares. I wouldn't know where to get them by and large. Expertise out there, or owners clubs will have mark specialist or model specialist. The vintage club will have a mark specialist, but you're drawing on so little compared with the later machines in terms of infrastructure, in terms of knowledge, that if you're getting into that kind of machine, you need to be the expert. So you're the one that needs to be able to fix it.
There's been a lot of negativity in this podcast, which we knew there would be because, well, we only ever see the bad ones, and obviously we want to warn people as much as we can. But I think it's worth that we put the case for why you should get a classic motorcycle in the first place.
Well, yeah, and we don't like being the bearers of bad news. So if we can, classic motorcycling, best fun you can have with your clothes on. So, I highly recommend it. But as I say in various places on the website, unless you're careful about what you buy, it could end up hitting you a lot harder in the pocket than you bargained for before you actually get in the saddle. And I do know people who've gone that route, haven't, done the required amount of due diligence, ended up spending an awful lot of money putting something right that should have been ready to go in the first place. And why, incidentally, these people don't go back to the vendors,
Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely mystifies me. And, the whole thing becomes, borderline nightmarish. And once they've got it sorted, actually, they've lost interest. So again, it's in our interest for, people's experience with classic motorcycles to be positive and enjoyable, because if it isn't, they're not going to stay in the fraternity.
Yeah, I mean, we can put the positive case all we like about you're not going to suffer depreciation and you're never going to be a Larry No Mates. Everybody wants to come and talk to you, but the truth is there are more people out there wanting a good classic bike than there are good classic bikes to be had.
Yeah, I mean, there's numbers out there, but a lot of those are going to need an awful lot of work, as nice as they may look, before it's a pleasurable experience.
Here's hoping that's helped you avoid a bad one. Why not let us know? To finish, here is this week's piece of advice. Today's quick piece of advice we'd like to share with you came about from Ray experimenting with some urban myths relating to the removal of rust. Isn't that right?
Absolutely right. The first problem we were presented with was the fact that we got a couple of vehicles that were really quite troublesome in terms of contaminated fuel tanks, and I mean contaminated by rust, and actually lots of it. And whilst we'd blown them out as we would normally do with compressed air and got rid of as much loose stuff as we could, this was still shedding from the interior of the fuel tank, and the deposit was particles in microns, so it was getting past filters and all sorts of things, and plugging up pilot jets in carburetors, and of course one of the old standbys years ago, and I'm going back to before classic bikes were even called classic bikes, the only real authority on the planet in respect of this sort of stuff was the Vintage Motorcycle Club, and their attitude at the time was, well, you got a bit of rust in your tank, put sealant in it anyway, just as a precautionary measure. Well, of course, this has since bit everybody on the bum with the consequence of bioethanol in the fuel, melting all of those old sealants and causing untold problems. So, and I've never been in favour of sealants for sealant's sake, nor, frankly, given my lifetime exposure so far to alleged carcinogenic chemicals, wasn't frightfully keen to start using some of the products that were available on the market for derusting fuel tanks or whatever. And I'd been vaguely aware of a few things, but actually then went on, the YouTube hunt to see what videos there were of people experimenting with these things, and there was one really very informative one from Australia, as it happens, where this guy was trying all sorts of remedies, including molasses, a non-brewed condiment, in other words, acetic acid, the clear stuff, and one of the products was apple cider vinegar. And he literally did a test case on each of them, and the one that came up head and shoulders better than anything else, actually miraculously so, was apple cider vinegar. Even the non-brewed vinegar wasn't even touching the rust, but the apple cider vinegar was. So I thought this might be useful for the two rusty tanks we got to deal with, but obviously took a slightly measured approach, slightly cautionary approach, in that I'd got a new old stock crankshaft that had sat around in a damp warehouse for about the last 50 years and was, very, very rusty. But it was only, just dense surface rust, and I didn't really want to have to go over and abrade the whole thing. And I thought, well, we're not going to cause any damage to something as substantial as a crankshaft. So I literally bought 10 litres of unpasteurised apple cider vinegar, put it in a bucket, dumped the crankshaft in the bucket for 3 days, and it came out, well, shining almost like a silver shilling up a chimney sweep's bum. And so as a consequence, we then tried it on the fuel tanks. I mean, you really do need to buy enough to be able to fill the tank substantially, or at least do it half at a time. And that can be quite an investment. But of course, once you've got it, this stuff will recycle many times before it loses its strength. And if you're in any doubt, a bit of litmus paper will prove that to you. And the results are really quite miraculous. We're still developing the technology to neutralise the product once we've finished with it, so that we can bring the reaction to a complete halt. But the result is truly dramatic, and what is more, it doesn't carry on eating the fuel tank. It literally only eats the rust. So, it's not going to suddenly rot the bottom out of a tank which is, perfectly sound. So not only is it safe to use in terms of what you're trying to deal with, but also from an operator point of view, unlike just about everything else we use in the workshop, even major exposure is not going to kill you.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a real treat to be using something that's not covered in all kinds of warnings. Although, when you see what that does to the inside of a fuel tank into a crankshaft, I know it's supposed to be good for you, but you think, do I really want to be drinking this? But I mean, the only other product we regularly use that actually goes out of its way to tell you it's not harmful was some black tyre paste we used, and although that wasn't harmful to the skin, I can assure you the pair of jeans I was wearing at the time will never be the same again. That's all for this week. You've been listening to me, Rowan, and my father, Ray. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and give us a review on iTunes. Just a reminder, our website is rjmclassic.com, and you can contact me directly about the podcast at rjmpodcast@gmail.com. See you next week for the penultimate episode in the series.